Good evening, everyone. So yes, I'm Elisa van Wijnberg, and I'm the Dean of the college that brings together the three departments of Economics, Development Studies, and Finance and Management, and our college is also known by the acronym of CODEF. It's really my pleasure to welcome you here to the double bill of CODEF inaugural lectures to be delivered by Professors Tom Tanner and Uli Volz. In their inaugural lectures, both Tom and Uli will be tackling issues related to one of the utmost urgent challenges of our time, the climate breakdown. They will be doing so, drawing from different disciplines, geography and economics respectively, and reflecting different yet complementary research interests. As I understand it, they will also offer reasons to be optimistic, which is much welcome in these troubling times. There is no need to comment on the dramatic state of the world in general. In the context of the environment, not a day goes by that we don't read about another horror story related to the unfolding climate disaster. Yesterday, some of you may or may not have noticed that newspapers carried an article indicated that the temperatures at the North Pole were at 20 Celsius degrees above average on Sunday. That's crossing the threshold for ice to melt. We're talking here about an extreme winter warming event. When we think about sea ice melting, we're thinking about the role that they habitually play in reflecting the sun, the implications for the Atlantic meridional overturning current, the fact that their role in acting as the Arctic acting as a carbon sink is being compromised, the fact that the permafrost will release carbon stored for millennia, etc. Now, we also know that the team around James Hansen, the former NASA scientist, which has been studying climate change for over 4 decades, has repeatedly warned that temperatures will hit 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2045. So it's against that backdrop, I hope that we can take some comfort that there is a vibrant community of scholars, including at SOAS, dedicated to excellent policy-relevant research in this urgent area. Indeed, the two colleagues delivering their inaugural lecture here today have built a tremendous track record of combining their scholarly activity with a strong mission and commitment to deeply anchored impact across different types of change-making spheres, from the local to the global. The first inaugural lecture will be delivered by Professor Tom Tanner. He's a professor of climate and society. He's a member of our Development Studies Department and the director of the Center for Development, Environment and Policy. Tom is a development geographer with an interest in resilience and adaptation to climate change. He has been particularly concerned with ways to place equity and justice at the heart of the adaptation challenge that development needs to overcome, including by amplifying the voices of those often marginalized in the debates, such as the youth. His lecture, with the title The Real Adaptation Gap, Development in a Climate-Changing World, will highlight how interdisciplinarity and the decolonization of knowledge offer pathways of hope. Our second inaugural lecture will be delivered by Professor Uli Volz, Professor of Economics in our Economics Department here at SOAS, and also the founding director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS. Uli has had a long-standing interest in macroeconomic policy, climate risk, sustainable finance, and financial sector development. And he combines these particular interests in his groundbreaking contributions that seek to identify mechanisms to climate-proof public finances. His lecture, with the title Reversing the Vicious Circle of Debt, Underdevelopment and Environmental Change, will discuss how the vicious circle of climate vulnerability, higher costs of sovereign debt, and declining fiscal space can be successfully broken so that countries regain the capacity to invest in resilience and sustainable development. Each lecture will last for over 30 minutes, for just under 30 minutes, and will be preceded by a formal introduction. There will be no question and answers, but there will be ample opportunities for discussion during the post-lectures drinks reception, which will take place in the foyer in front of the lecture theater. So with all that, let me please invite Professor Declan Conway, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's a really wonderful occasion. So I'm going to introduce Professor Tom Tanner, and we've known one another for about 20 years. We first met around about 2004, and we were brought together by a civil servant, an advisor in the UK Department for International Development, who was commissioning a piece of work to try to understand the risks that climate change might represent for the UK government's development investments in Bangladesh. And Tom and I had been brought together. Tom had expertise in Bangladesh on this topic and had lived and worked there for a year or a year and a half earlier in the noughties. And I was brought in to add some expertise on the climate side, and also to steer a little bit the project. However, when we got out to Bangladesh, I very quickly realised that actually Tom had a very strong handle on the project, what we were aiming to do, and how to go about doing that. And in the end, I learned a lot from him, and it was a really interesting experience. And we were based in Bangladesh, 2 or 3 visits for a week at a time, and very pleasurable to work with him. And also, I learned a lot in that process. So, how do you sum up a career to date of someone? It's very, very difficult to do that, particularly someone who has been so productive and done such a diverse set of things. So I thought I would look at Google Scholar, at Tom's page, and from that it's clear that he's been very productive. He has a lot of well-cited publications in all his outputs over the years. And so I thought I would do a word cloud of the titles of his academic publications to see what we get from that. And this really captures the kind of essence of a lot of his work, which is at the interface of climate change, resilience, development, and adaptation. And I think if there is a kind of overarching theme in his work, it's that he has brought a development lens to climate change. And that's from about the mid-2000s. And prior to that, I think it's fair to say that people like myself and others that were dabbling in development, we were coming at development, or coming at things with a climate change lens. And Tom and some of his colleagues at the Institute of Development Studies really turned things around and asked the questions about what does climate change mean for development, with a deep understanding of development processes, actors, and the development landscape. So that's a kind of overarching set of themes which have come out of his work. And I wanted, on the top right-hand side, just, I think, to highlight a couple of aspects of work that comes through his career that I think have been important to him and really comprise the contribution that he makes. The first of which is that a lot of his work is driven by values. He's worked on providing a platform and a voice for children in a changing climate. He's worked very hard to promote a poverty reduction agenda through looking at climate change and development, and was editor of a very highly cited IDS bulletin in around 2008 on reducing poverty in a changing climate. Secondly, impact. So having worked at the Institute of Development Studies for a long period of time, and then at the Overseas Development Institute, there is no way that you can't become embedded in academic, but also policy and practitioner activities and communities. And a lot of his work cuts across that and has made a massive contribution to the applied side of research in linking development and environment. And not least actually through his role as a lecturer and a tutor through the Masters at the University of Sussex on climate change and development. And I know he was very successful there with a lot of students in terms of translating his his working knowledge of development and climate and applying that in a classroom situation. And then thirdly, right through much of his work is this theme of innovation. And there are three examples that I want to pick up in terms of his innovation. One is the concept of livelihoods, which was very well established in the development arena, and Tom was part of a team of people that really promoted and highlighted the potential of applications of livelihood frameworks to a climate change vulnerability context. Secondly, a lot of pioneering work around the concept of social protection, which is has been a huge part of overseas development assistance over the last 15 years. And Tom and colleagues were really the first people to think about using social protection as a vehicle for what they called adaptive social protection. Can it be used to deliver vulnerability reduction to communities in a changing climate? And then lastly, and one of the big concepts there, resilience. Tom has taken a very critical stance looking at what resilience means for communities and for development processes, and made strong contributions there in terms of academic understanding and use of that term, and really been at the cutting edge of a lot of thinking on these topics. So to wrap up then, it really is a pleasure and an honour in a way to introduce him here for his presentation. It's a richly deserved chair, highly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and a big contribution across a whole range of sort of socially relevant applications of academic knowledge and so on. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Tom Tanner to tell us all about his work. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start by situating the lecture where much of my understanding on this topic started for me in Bangladesh. I spent my formative climate change years working in the government there, helping set up the first ever climate change office in the Department of Environment. And the context in Bangladesh is illustrative of the complexities of tackling climate change and their impacts across the world. In the coastal zone, climate change is adding to flooding through a combination of increased and more intense rainfall, more intense cyclones, and also through rising sea levels. However, those impacts are compound, so they're overlaid onto human-altered landscapes that include, amongst other things, a polar system that was transplanted problematically from a model in the Netherlands, upstream dam storage that alters flows, growing landless class of rural labourers, and the lowering of land anyway through conversion to agriculture, and the more recent transfer to saline shrimp farming for export markets. So these combine with the climate change impacts to create other environmental impacts, such as those of growing salinity of both the groundwater and soils. So as such, the impacts of climate change aren't experienced only in terms of changing hazards, described in much of the scientific literature, but rather those impacts and responses needed to adapt to them need to be contextualized within the wider development landscape in which they're nested. I'm deeply honoured to have been conferred the title of professor at this prestigious university. And what I didn't know when I applied to become a professor was that I could choose my own title. And in situations of deep uncertainty like this, which is appropriate for a climate change researcher, where do you turn? Situations of deep uncertainty. You turn, of course, to the group chat. And this one consists of former colleagues, inhabitants of the Beaver Bar at the London School of Economics. And so I put it out. Okay, Beaver hive mind. Apparently I can be professor of X and I get to name the X. Suggestions? Sensible stroke clean ones. Professor of climate science. It'll get you on TV. Cooler to be professor of Anthropocene studies. Either one gets you destroyed on social media. That's probably fair. So The Anthropocene is a relatively new concept, and human interference in the planetary ecosystem has passed 6 of the 9 boundaries that have been defined by environmental and climate scientists, leading to the definition of a new geological age, the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment, coined by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer as the Anthropocene. And while it's widely accepted that we are indeed in this new era, debate persists, of course, firstly over when it started, that's occupying a lot of people's time, but also, and I think more importantly, whether its name should more directly reflect the crisis of capitalism as the root of this damage, the Capitalocene. What is clear is that the world's experiencing an unprecedentedly rapid change in the atmospheric system. Human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, reductions in carbon sinks such as forests continue to rise, and the gap shown here between the trajectory that currently, even if we meet all the UN pledges, which you can see in the top 3 trajectories there, none of them get close to keeping us within the safe limits of 2 degrees or preferably 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, beyond which some low-lying places such as coastal Bangladesh and even entire nations face existential risk. Crucially, these impacts are not distributed geographically evenly, and nor are they linear. So there's mounting scientific evidence, even at the 1.5 degree rise that now appears inevitable, of the potential to trigger multiple climate tipping points such as polar ice sheet collapse, major changes to deep water ocean currents, and coral reef dieback. So whatever actions we take to mitigate emissions, there's a really strong imperative to adapt, to make adjustments to the impacts of a changing climate, either in response to things happening and change happening, or in anticipation, preferably, and to moderate the harm that might be caused, but also, and importantly, to exploit potential benefits. So when I first started working on climate impacts, the narrative from those scientific models was that climate change was coming down the line. The models were projecting for the mid-century and the end of the century. But since then, the consistent rising of global temperatures and the growing incidence of extreme weather within the trend has made it much clearer that adaptation is an absolute imperative globally. Any more suggestions? Can't be a scientist. Professor of Adaptation and Resilience. Nice. Professor of Climate and Development. Well, it speaks to me. But should you avoid a Eurocentric binary? To which, oh my God, SOAS. But despite the Eurocentric binary, adaptation and resilience does speak directly to my field of expertise, and one that's increasingly urgent, if not straightforward. Given the extent of climate-related impacts that we're already seeing around the world, a large adaptation gap exists between what's needed and what's currently being implemented. And this gap, there is even now an annual report that documents this gap. And I would argue part of the challenge remains that our differentiated conceptual framings around adaptation are part of the problem. My work with Jeremy Alouche at IDS, but also those of others like Johan Dupuy, Peter Knopfel, have highlighted how these different framings imply different interpretations for both the collective problem, but also the solutions that are prescribed as a result. So I'm going to break it into 3 framings, the first of which focuses on the incremental addition to the hazard burden that climate change presents, this extra bit that the scientists tell us is important. So that might be the change in rainfall, it might be the change in temperature that's distinct from if humans hadn't caused the problem. And the framing's driven by scientific models, and they have to demonstrate that these anthropogenic drivers are distinct from the other factors driving variability in the weather and climate. So in other words, they've got to prove that human-caused climate change is real. And the UN and Framework Convention on Climate Change reinforces that because it's focused on that additional increment that's caused by humans. And as such, it orients policy accordingly. And it orients climate finance accordingly, which is important. It should be distinct. It's the human-caused element, and it should be precisely additional and new from the existing flows of international finance like aid. But this climate change specific framing generates a much more hazard-centric view. So for example, it leads us to understand the Bangladesh coastal context as a stark map, right, with and without sea level rise, and it just counts the number of people who live in those areas, and it gives us these numbers that are so beloved of global media accounts of climate change worldwide. It tells us little, however, about the complexity of the livelihood processes and the politics that deal with those rising sea levels and increased flooding. And the approaches, therefore, have been critiqued for tending to favour the kind of incremental approaches that favour engineering and technology as solutions to plug the gap, to plug that incremental gap, and literally plug the gap in the case of things like seawalls and flood defences by raising them X centimetres higher. By centering our efforts instead on the additional hazard burden in the context of the existing variations in the climate, we can get a much more nuanced picture of climate change, not just as a trend, but actually understand the variability of climate within which that larger trend is embedded. So we see here the rising global temperature coming and going through the years, but certainly a trend towards higher warming, especially in recent years. But importantly, this distribution around the mean and the way that changes to show that extremes of weather, and particularly heat in this case, are increasing massively. So a second framing of adaptation to climate change has been centred on this variability of climate, and most notably operationalised through the construct of climate risk management. So a process of incorporating knowledge and information on climate-related events, trends, forecasts, and projections into decision-making. And again, to maintain benefits or reduce harms and losses. This has a real advantage of setting adaptation to climate change in the context of existing decision-making structures. It's drawn in a lot of people working on those who already manage risk in sectors such as finance, insurance, water management, and even welfare provision in things like social protection. And my early work with Declan Conway applied this sort of risk management approach to the design and delivery of international aid portfolios in Bangladesh and elsewhere. And it's been a dominant approach in the private sector in particular as a way of managing business operations and supply chains in the face of climate shocks. The rise in popularity of the concept of resilience has been really absorbed and integrated into that climate risk management approach. It's been quite ill-defined as simply bouncing back, but actually at a conceptual level it's brought a lot more, a much more nuanced understanding to the linked relationships between human and environmental systems. Those complex interrelationships between the dynamic systems, this within the concept of panarchy from social and ecological systems, trying to understand the way that there's a nested hierarchy of systems, some more dynamic over the short term, some more dynamic over the longer term, and their interrelationships. So this starts from a kind of ecological perspective, and we've really used it within things like urban environments to look at the way that a water system and an information technology system and a transport system might actually interact within an urban context, particularly in the context of climate shocks. And nowhere has that been more instrumental in helping bring together sectors and disciplinary approaches than in urban contexts. And with my longtime collaborator, Aditi Bahadur, we laid out and critiqued how the concept has informed responses to climate change in urban areas in recent years. And we highlighted, we're optimists, we highlighted its potential, but we also critique the dangers of using the concept to protect and revert to the status quo. So even when that reversion to the status quo is then driving the very patterns of inequality that shape the high-risk landscape for many of the urban citizens. Which brings us neatly to the third framing around climate vulnerability, and one that's much more development-informed, which I picked up in my textbook with Leo Horn-Pathanatai, and one where insights from scholars in the Global South have been really instrumental, particularly bringing the adaptation policy issue as a policy issue due to the likes of scholar-stroke activists like Salim al-Haq, Fatima Denton and others, making the case that adaptation needed to be framed in the context of vulnerability and the related processes that influence exposure, sensitivity, and the capacity to adapt. And understanding these vulnerability contexts that link human and climate factors becomes the key to developing adaptation strategies to help tackle the impacts of climate change. It ensures that flood management doesn't simply push water into the poorer parts of a city, for example. It ensures that adaptation in agriculture thinks about local knowledge of what, how, and when to plant in anticipation of a changing climate, rather than just new seed varieties being imposed from above. And as such, the field of development studies has helped make the case that enables us to understand adaptation as a contested socio-political process that in turn mediates the responses to a wider range of environmental and social changes which overlap and may occur at the same time. Without this understanding, to quote an influential paper from Andrea Nightingale and others, the uncertainty and risk framing by planners and policymakers at global and national levels leads to techno-managerialist solutions, we love that phrase, which have little to do with the experiences and lived realities of people at local levels. And my own experiences of work in Nepal similarly foregrounded the importance of understanding these local level experiences and the perceptions of climate change. So we highlighted how the scientific models failed to capture what was in fact the most important impact on farmers across a national survey, which was wind damage to crops. That was not being picked up in the models, and therefore it wasn't being fed into policy solutions. And that in turn leads to adaptation initiatives that were failing to capture the ways that both impacts and adaptive responses are appropriate and meaningful to local contexts. And in research on the political economy of climate change, we've shown how that sort of contestation also alters as it transcends scales. So the result is we looked at international adaptation financing initiatives and the ways that they undergo political negotiation, renegotiation, reconceptualization as they move from the international through the national to the subnational to the local context. And what it meant was that changes, that the local realities that were seen didn't match the international vision for those initiatives, but rather they were seen as a sign of failure. We were presenting them as this is a process that needs to be explicitly understood in order to ensure that these initiatives are sustainable, locally owned, and promote justice both in process and outcome. But justice brings me back to the WhatsApp chat. So from an international perspective, I need to go through it. I wanted a funkier title from these guys. So the Eager Beavers suggested Professor of Climate Justice, highlighting those elements, or Professor of Transformations, which is something I can't abide. Ugh. It doesn't say how change happens, to which the suggestion was Professor of Rage Against the Machine, which I do like. So from an international perspective, climate change presents one of the greatest global injustices of the Anthropocene era. Richer countries and richer people everywhere have historically and continue to knowingly cause a problem that creates harms that disproportionately affect those in poorer countries and the people who've done least to cause the problem. Scholars such as Farhana Sultana have linked this to historic and ongoing injustices in the form of carbon colonialism. And recently, scholarships examined how adaptation processes themselves can add to this injustice. A recent review led by Siri Eriksson and colleagues, looking at past and current adaptation interventions, highlighted the risk of so-called maladaptation. So the outcomes that can inadvertently reinforce, redistribute, or create new sources of vulnerability. Jessica Omakuti's research has shown how the international financing requirements for demonstrating country ownership in adaptation projects have actually had the effect of limiting the engagement of non-government and local actors in adaptation projects in Tanzania. And some of my work in Bangladesh highlighted the ways that institutional capture and contestation can actually serve as barriers to the scaling up of potential anticipatory approaches based on predictive early warning systems. Kasha Kaproki at LSE, her research in Bangladesh similarly illustrates how adaptation projects themselves can serve to marginalise agrarian communities and instead promote the development priorities of local elites. But bypassing those elites can also be maladaptive, and research from Mushtaq Khan and his team here at SOAS show how actively engaging elites in those projects and their monitoring can actually help reduce corruption and lead to better outcomes. So in turn, scholarships provided this justice framing to insert normative and applied frameworks for promoting social justice in adaptation processes and implementation, allied with an accompanying interest in adaptation as transformational change, although transformational adaptation has been variously defined, particularly in more apolitical terms, so in terms of the depth of change, the duration of change, or the sustainability, or the catalytic nature of change. But increasingly, and my preference, has been to frame it in terms of rights and social justice. And I've written with others about the need to take a more human rights-based approach to livelihoods in a changing climate, where we create moral and legal obligations to respond, including through anticipatory adaptive measures. And using evidence from northern India, Aditya Bahadur and I argued that operationalizing resilience frameworks needs explicit attention to politics, power, agency, and social justice. Otherwise, they can easily be co-opted to help this bounce back to the status quo, or worse, to shift responsibility onto the victims of climate shocks themselves. Another strand of my research has engaged with the concern and justice claims of children and young people, and through participatory action research with groups in the Global South, that's enabled groups to research their own situations and enhance their own voices locally and even internationally. So in doing so, that process is helping develop people's own agency for determining how to adapt, rather than simply being painted as victims of climate change, as children so often are. This sort of agency has helped also move the focus of activism among youth from a global north-centric focus just on emissions and rapid emissions reductions towards calls for equity on adaptation and payments to address the losses and damages that occur when adaptation is insufficient or ineffective. In terms of transformation, Karen O'Brien and colleagues have helpfully identified 3 spheres of transformation, where the more instrumental practical sphere covers the behavioural and technical responses, which are necessary but not sufficient, because they're set within the larger spheres of transformation, those political spheres of systems and structures that I've just referred to, but also these personal spheres of beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. So alongside the efforts to enhance agency of marginalised groups like children and youth, colleagues like Pablo Suarez have helped many in the field of adaptation and elsewhere by opening this personal sphere to reflect on our own positionalities in adaptation and to actively seek out and integrate other forms of knowledge. So adaptation is increasingly turning the lens on the research process itself. And Zoa Shawu and colleagues have highlighted how decolonising knowledge requires us to address funding structures, funding processes, prioritising meaningful partnerships and co-production in our research methodologies, and ensuring that research findings and recommendations are discussed with local stakeholders and consider local power dynamics. So there's a need for disciplinary and epistemological pluralism, including widening our understandings to include historical perspectives and to meet the call from Amitav Ghosh and others for greater engagement with the arts. However, there is growing engagement of this wide range of disciplines and geographies in more integrated approaches to adaptation, and growing moves to decolonise knowledge and bring in knowledges from a more diverse set of fields and places. And that, for me, is a reason for optimism. And the growth of university courses, professional opportunities, they're geared towards understanding and tackling climate-related impacts, is testament not only to the adaptation imperative, but also our ability to harness a broader set of knowledges to help us tackle the climate crisis. So as such, the adaptation gap is one that requires not just experts and elites, but also wider societal participation, knowledge, and a willingness to adapt. And that's why, despite the Eurocentric binary, I've decided on the title of Professor of Climate and Society. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. That was wonderful. And I truly enjoyed you taking us on your journey of deliberating what the title of your chair should be. So that was fabulous. And before I invite the introducer to our second lecture, I just wanted also to express my appreciation in the way in which you surface what I see as key features of SOAS scholarship, both starting with C, one context, the other contestation. So I think that was very nice, the way, through your journey that starts in Bangladesh, where you continuously remind us of the importance of context, and then at the same time emphasizing that everything that we do in this particular sphere is going to be hotly contested, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So thank you very much. So with that, let me please invite Professor Matthew Agarwala to introduce our second lecture.
So thank you very much, Dean Elisa, Professor Conway, Professor Tanner, Professor Volz. I have the distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce my friend and colleague and mentor, really, Uli. We met maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I was still a PhD student, I think, at the time, just across the road at the London School of Economics. And I had known of Uli's work on climate change, on sovereign debt markets, on macroeconomics, but I hadn't quite understood just how plugged into policy and engaging with the real world Uli really was. And so, as a PhD student, getting to meet a professor like that who delivers not just on the research across multiple disciplines, but also on actually taking that research out into the real world and having an impact in helping those countries build the capacity to understand how climate change and its related consequences might affect not just their current economic situation, but also the prospects for growth and development and improvements in the quality of life over time. That was really an exciting and inspiring opportunity for me. I got to become a co-author of Uli's, which I think has completely transformed my own career, going from a PhD student at that time. Now I have a professorship at the University of Sussex. I'm wearing their robes tonight. It's been an interesting ride for me to go from the PhD student who's inspired by this professor to the co-author who's working with and still inspired by this professor, to the professor who's working with and now competing against in grant applications for, and yet still somehow inspired by this professor. I think there is no chance that in my 5 minutes today I would be able to give a sufficient overview of the research that Uli has produced for us. So I'd like to focus on just the areas where we've sort of connected, which is around how climate change has affected sovereign debt markets and how it will do so in the future. And this matters crucially for development, because sovereign debt, borrowing, public borrowing, is the means through which countries invest in themselves. Here in the UK, it is how we build infrastructure. It is how we repaid the debts after the war. It is how we deliver major projects. It's how we managed our way through the pandemic. But that is for a high-income, fairly lucky, fairly wealthy economy. Uli's work focuses mostly on those countries that are most heavily exposed to the sharp end of climate change, those most vulnerable to the storms and the floods and the fires and the heat waves. And not just to climate change, but also to biodiversity loss, which brings about pandemics and ill health and poor water quality. And so I've really enjoyed working with Uli across these disciplines that brings in the science, that brings in the climate, and that brings in the finance. I think one of the most exciting parts of working with Uli is that I'm just as likely to meet him here in London at an event like this as I am to meet him at the World Bank or the IMF in Washington, or at a conference somewhere in East Asia. And the reason this is really exciting is because it shows how plugged in he is to the policy decisions and those discussions and those debates around the world. We all know professors that deliver the research, and we all know professors that deliver the teaching. That's part of the job. But what Uli really excels in as well is making sure there's a real-world impact. And I think, especially today, given the tectonic shifts in the geopolitical realities that we face, it's especially important to have someone like Uli who is plugged in to the central banks and to the finance ministries and to the universities in all of these developing countries so that they can build their capacity to understand and plan and manage the risks associated with climate change and with nature loss. I think in a field of economics and finance, which is not always the friendliest, most welcoming, warmest place to work, it's especially helpful to have someone like Uli, who can remind us that we can be kind, friendly colleagues without sacrificing rigor or our exacting academic standards. And I think that in a world with a real hunger for accurate financial information to identify, to price, and to manage the financial risks associated with climate change, it's especially important to have a researcher, a scientist, an academic like Uli, who takes the research to that front line to actually give quantifiable indicators that can be used and integrated in financial decision making. We all know climate change is bad, but that's not enough. We need to know how it affects financial outcomes in order to be able to make better decisions. And that's the kind of work that Uli delivers. And that's why I'm so delighted to be able to introduce him today for this inaugural lecture. Thank you, Uli.
Well, thank you so much for these incredibly warm words, and Matthew is probably the only one who would say so nice stuff about me. So, well, it's great to be here, and I really won't be able to deliver as funky a presentation as Tom did, and I'm just a boring professor of economics. I didn't even think about how should I, call myself professor of something, but so I'll talk about the economics of debt, underdevelopment, and climate change, and I hope that I can convey that this is actually a thing that really matters, and for a lot of people, finance, macroeconomics is like very abstract, but it has really a big impact on everyone's lives, so let me just talk through the problem. And so last couple of years I've been working a lot on the problem, but I've been also trying to see what can we do about it, what are the solutions, because if you just work on the problems it's a little bit depressing. And so the problem, and it's actually very nice to follow up on Tom because he's kind of set the ground. Climate change is really a major threat to the economic development of countries. And future development is at threat. And the problem is that the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, like Bangladesh, but so many others, they really need to invest massively in adaptation, in resilience, to climate-proof their economies, and also to climate-proof their public finances, because whatever is happening in the economy at the end of the day will also have an impact on public finances. And if a government is broke, if it doesn't have any fiscal space, then it can't invest in development, it can't invest in resilience adaptation, but also social development. So it is a real challenge, and we not only have climate change, but also we see a very rapid depletion of ecosystems around the world, which is partly fostered by climate change, but also is then also accelerating climate change. But that, again, and that's now growing recognition, is also a threat to economic development. Depleting nature may, in the short run, deliver growth, but in the long run, it's undermining the foundation of our economies. And so I've been framing that in terms of a vicious circle, where climate change, nature loss, really worsen the fiscal situation of countries. So they're hitting the economy, they're worsening the fiscal situation of countries. They are facing higher sovereign risk, that's how you call that in financial markets, affecting the ability of countries to repay debt. Financial markets will respond to that with higher interest rates, a higher cost of capital, which then means that countries are even worse off and can invest even less. And this is kind of a vicious circle. And if we look at current climate finance, it's a very sad story. And specifically, if we look also at adaptation finance, it's even more sad. The amount of money spent on adaptation globally is really terribly small, and the amount of adaptation finance going into those countries that need it the most, it's just depressing. And what's really making life so much more difficult for developing countries is that the cost of capital, so the interest that governments have to pay, is very high, and that is feeding through to the entire economies. Also, corporations, households, they also face a higher cost of capital, really inhibiting the whole economy to invest in anything, broader development, but also in climate action. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is not a trend towards more climate finance or also development finance, but we've been seeing cuts. And the new US administration has just completely cut the overseas aid. I can say that we have also received a letter of suspension, which is putting some of our work at risk, but we'll manage because it's important, and we're determined to continue that. But so the question is really, how can we enhance investment in resilience, in adaptation, in sustainable development more broadly, and stop this vicious circle and turn it around and really create a virtuous circle with more investment in resilience and so on. And this is what I'll be talking about. So let me give you a few takes on describing the problem further based on some of the research that I've done with a bunch of wonderful colleagues, including dear Matthew, over the last decade or so on this topic. And then I'll turn to solutions. And I mean, I won't have very much time to give details, but there is a lot we can do. And I think, we don't really have any other choice than to try to work on the solutions, because just despairing is not making anything better. So, 2017, so I've been working a lot on the topic of sustainable finance, and so I've been, for 15 years or so, trying to make the point that if we really want to make our economies more sustainable, we need to integrate climate sustainability concerns into financial markets, because that's where the decisions are made about allocation of capital. Now, and an important part is, making finance aware of risks, including climate risks. But the problem then, of course, is if finance is analyzing these risks, then the question is, higher risk means also higher cost, because financial institutions will price the risk. And so we were thinking about, okay, what does it mean for those who are actually facing the biggest risk? And then we started looking at the impact of climate change and climate vulnerability on the most vulnerable countries. And so that was research that we did with UNEP at the time, 2017, and we were able to show for the first time that climate vulnerability was actually driving up the cost of capital in vulnerable countries. And we had a bunch of studies, and that's been also replicated by many others, and very much reinforcing the point. And so we've been digging a bit deeper in that, but the message is very simple. Climate vulnerability is driving up the cost of capital in countries that, developing countries that are facing higher cost of capital anyway. So it's making an existing problem even worse. And here you have a chart, and that's just very new data from December, where you can see that there's on the x-axis there's a climate vulnerability score. So basically, the further right you are, the higher your climate vulnerability. And on the y-axis, we have the 10-year sovereign bond yield. So that's basically the cost of capital that countries have to pay when they borrow in international capital markets. And you can see that there is a very clear positive relationship, and more vulnerable countries, everything else being equal, have to pay a higher cost of capital, which, as I said before, is really making life much, much more difficult for them. Here you have the same, just with over 10 years, where we've classified countries into 3 groups. A low vulnerability group, so basically countries like the UK, which have relatively low climate vulnerability, and you can see that they have a fairly low cost of capital. And that's basically the rich countries, which have better infrastructure and are also able to invest more in infrastructure and in resilience and everything else. And they have a low cost of capital, which also facilitates all that. Then we have a medium vulnerability group, so with respect to climate vulnerability, and they have to pay a markup. But then we have the highly vulnerable group, and they have a much higher rate of interest. And so you can see that as of December, they have to pay on average 12%. And you don't need to be a math genius to figure out that at 12%, any type of investment is much, much more difficult than when you're paying 3 or 4%. Yeah? And that's a massive problem. And again, it's not only public finance, it's also, there's a so-called sovereign ceiling effect. The sovereign typically can borrow money more cheaply than anyone else in the economy. So it's feeding through to the entire economy. And so in this UN study that we published in 2018, we showed that vulnerable countries were paying this climate risk premium. And what we estimated at the time for a group of highly climate vulnerable countries was that they had to pay 117 basis points on top. Now that sounds very abstract, but it means, for example, that if you pay $10 of debt service, you have to pay an extra $1 because of your climate vulnerability. And in the aggregate, these are huge amounts, and for the poorest countries. And back then, I framed that in this kind of vicious cycle of climate vulnerability, debt, and underdevelopment. So we have the climate risk premium that countries have to pay because of the higher cost of capital. Their fiscal space is constrained, so they're undertaking less investment in resilience. Climate change is getting worse. With lack of adaptation, vulnerabilities are rising, and then, it gets even worse. And so since then, we've been looking at how can we reverse this cycle. Now, as Matthew mentioned, and that's one of the areas where we've collaborated, nature risk is making things even worse. So the depletion of nature is also threatening economic viability. And again, the poorer countries tend to be more dependent on nature and nature services. And so in a number of research studies, we've shown that nature risk is threatening debt sustainability, looking at different nature loss scenarios, and is also threatening massive downgrades by sovereign credit rating agencies. which again would result in significantly higher cost of capital. So, and nature risk and climate risk is very intertwined, and really one has to look at both. So, I hope it's not, I haven't depressed you too much, but it's a very bleak picture. And of course, to pick up on Tom's point about climate justice, this is of course deeply unjust, because climate vulnerable countries, the poorest countries, have contributed little to nothing to global climate change, and they are the ones that are disproportionately affected by the physical impacts of climate change, but they're also, you know, getting a second hammer from international financial markets, and they have to pay this climate risk premium. So it's a second blow, making their life so much more difficult. And so this is deeply unjust, but that's what it is. And the question is, what can be done about it? And of course, and unfortunately, there are no easy solutions, so no silver bullets, but there is a lot that can be done, and I've tried to group that into four buckets, and I'll quickly run through each of them without really giving justice to any of those. But the first one, and a very obvious one, is building resilience. Yeah? So massively investing in adaptation resilience. That's not only kind of physical resilience, also kind of social resilience. Bangladesh, for example, is a great example of how you can, you know, prepare society for climate change. Bangladesh has been at the forefront of climate change, and you know, kind of, there's a lot of stuff you can do to you know, early warning systems and all that, to make the economy, society more resilient. But there's also a lot you can do more on the financial side, which is where I'm focusing on. The second is, you know, to really bring down the cost of capital, which is such a big problem. You need that, you know, structurally, there's no way around really mobilizing domestic savings, reducing dependency on international finance, which will almost always be foreign currency finance, which is coming with tremendous risk and all that. So, and to do that, we need a much larger role of public financial institutions. I mean, I've been also working a lot with private financial institutions, and we need to align the financial system more broadly with climate sustainability goals, but the hope that private finance will solve that problem, I think we can forget about this. And certainly the hope that we will have a lot of private finance, international private finance, go into the most vulnerable places and, you know, at low cost finance everything that needs to be financed. I mean, that's not going to happen. And unfortunately, political realities are also such that, you know, international development aid, international climate finance is not going to increase. So right now, it's looking rather the other way around. So strengthening domestic resource mobilization, mobilizing domestic financial institutions is an important agenda. And then the third point, despite, you know, what I've just said about the international challenges, we need to also scale up international finance. And then the last area which has occupied me a lot over the last couple of years is we already have a lot of countries facing severe debt problems, partly very much reinforced because of the climate crisis. And we need, many countries will need some form of debt relief to really get back on their feet. So I think I have around 5 minutes. Yeah? So let me run through that. So first point, building resilience and climate-proofing the economy and public finances. So the starting point, from my view, clearly has to be we need to have a much better understanding of what are the main risks for public finances, for economies. And the reality is that most finance ministries, most governments don't really have a good understanding. I mean, everyone knows, yeah, you know, climate is a big risk, but what are the sectors of the economy that are particularly at risk? How is that affecting public finances? How are exports going to be affected and all that? There's very little understanding. about that. I mean, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on, they're now getting onto this topic. We've been pushing them quite a bit. But so building really capacities in governments, in finance ministries, other key ministries is critical. And not only to understand the risk, but then also consider what are viable policy responses, and in particular also what are viable resilience adaptation strategies given limited funds. And so that's one area where we've been really working very hard, and also in the spirit of what Tom said, we not just need international experts who say, oh, that's the problem and here's the solution, but we need a lot of local expertise. And we've been working very closely with international partners in governments, but also universities. And we've set up a program called Resilience Adaptation Mainstreaming Program, where we've just lost the funding from the US government, which is about building capacities at local universities to really analyze these risks and to not only educate the next generation of leaders, but also do capacity building advisory work with their finance ministries and other government bodies. So that's the first area. The second one is about really addressing the more structural issues around the high cost of capital on which kind of the climate risk premium comes on top. And if we look at the history of economic development, and that actually for economists is a good thing to do at times, there is not really an economy, except maybe for some petrostates, that managed to develop without mobilizing domestic savings and without creating a local financial system that can create credit and channel that to productive investment. And I often have the feeling that there is a lot of discussion about, how can we fix the global monetary financial system to bring down the cost of capital, and that's super important, and I'm also part in these discussions. But fundamentally, to really address the core problem of high cost of capital without mobilizing domestic savings, building a local financial system, you're not really going to address the structural problem. And some may say, oh, but poor countries, they have very low savings, they can't really mobilize resources, and how? But the point is, these countries want to develop, and they will not develop if they don't start on the process. And very importantly, and we've shown that in a study that we published half a year ago, developing emerging countries, including the poorest countries, are actually often exporting very significant amounts of capital to the rest of the world. So we're always talking about how can we mobilize international capital to kind of solve the problems. And again, we need to do that. But that's from a report we published in October. We show that a lot of capital is actually flowing uphill. And to our estimates, over the last 2 decades, developing emerging economies, excluding China, exported, they built up foreign assets, including central bank reserves, to the tune of $16 trillion. Now, that's a lot of money that, at least in part, could have been invested domestically. And if you look, for example, and we did that, at where do African pension funds put their money? Many of them park really the majority of it abroad. And, they should be putting some of the money abroad, but not the majority. And so we used some data from the IMF, which estimated the SDG financing gap. And we looked also at the average reserve assets acquired over the last 2 decades. And, the amount of assets they have acquired abroad and the reserve assets they've acquired abroad would plug a big hole in this SDG financing gap. And so we really need to look at how can we mobilize domestic savings for domestic investment Here we argue that we really need a much larger role of public financial institutions, national development banks, could be also pension funds, and we have a lot of very good examples from economic history. And so one thing, and we're working very closely with different partners on that, how can we use multilateral development banks, international development finance institutions, to help strengthen, empower national development banks to really replicate what the international institutions are doing. And that is mobilize private capital, for example, through bond issuances, and then put it to good use. And public financial institutions have a mandate to support development. And they should be, of course, operating profitably, but they don't have the same profitability imperatives that private financial institutions have. And we won't have time to go much more into that, but there are a lot of interesting things that can be also done to leverage digital approaches to mobilize capital. And my favorite example is what the Central Bank of Kenya did, where they set up a new way of issuing government bonds, where people, like small people, could buy them on their mobile phone in very small quantities. And that's a very easy way of mobilizing savings. And if we can generate kind of relatively safe investable assets that really can be bought by a broader group of people, create safe assets, that can be an important point. Now, of course, we do need to also push for more international support, and from a climate justice perspective, that really should be an imperative. But private international capital is expensive, and kind of the risk-adjusted return expectations that private investors have are very high, and most climate adaptation projects, also mitigation projects, will never really meet these expectations. Adaptation and mitigation projects also don't deliver foreign currency returns, so that would also leave massive exchange risk. So instead of having developing countries go to international capital markets, pay these enormously high prices, which are then pushing them effectively into debt problems, we should be using international institutions, international facilities much more to borrow private capital internationally, but at low cost, and then on lend. And that's effectively what MDBs have been doing, but we need to do that on a much larger level. And there has been a very intensive World Bank MDB reform agenda over the last 2 or 3 years. But we've been also putting forward some proposals, replicating actually something that under the leadership of the UK was done 18 years ago, setting up a facility just based on the guarantees of a couple of donor countries to issue bonds at low cost, bring in a lot of capital, and then finance Gavi, the Alliance for Vaccination. And we're basically saying, let's do something like that on steroids, and we just need a bunch of willing countries. And I think that's becoming even more important now that the US is kind of dropping out of all this. And I won't go into that, but you know, there are other things, targeted allocations of special drawing rights and so on. And then the last point I just want to make is, again, we already have a large group of developing countries, 50, 60, that are in severe debt distress. And the current system is such that they will do everything to avoid a default, because they know they won't be treated fairly. The process for dealing with defaulting countries is a very tough one. Often it will take years. Zambia, for example, has been in this for many years. They still don't have an agreement with private creditors. And we've been arguing that it is a time to have a new, I mean, of course, we need a broader reform of the international debt architecture. But what we need now is an ambitious debt relief initiative that will really help those countries that are severely struggling, that are not defaulting on their debt, but that are defaulting on development and climate action, to really get some relief, to get back on their feet, to invest in what we call green and inclusive recoveries. And so that's something where we've been also pushing very much. And the World Bank chief economist recently published a text which was basically very much endorsing what we've been saying for the last 3 years. And he was the first one among the major international financial institutions to really get away from this narrative that, oh, this is just a liquidity problem. Anyway, so the problem is a really acute one. We really need to ramp up action. We need to front load finance on climate adaptation, on resilience. And without doing that, we will really see this vicious circle becoming more and more forceful. And we see that already in many countries. And so, again, it's not that I have the silver bullet, but there are a lot of things that we can do and really should be doing to turn this vicious circle into a virtuous circle of growing resilience, more investment in resilience adaptation, better ways of dealing with the climate risks, and then really make also sure that everyone in financial markets and so on knows about it, and that the rewards will be yielded. And so with this, thank you very much. And you're supposed to fill out the feedback. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Uli, for this very kind of quick tour through a whole set of solutions that are available to us and that hopefully will be mobilized to break, as you say, to transform the vicious to the virtuous circle. And as you were doing so, I was again picking up on some of the kind of what I see as the key features of SOAS scholarship, and I think you successfully do this connection of very highly abstract types of concepts. We're talking debt, sovereign, what does it cost to raise money in capital markets, to very concrete issues in terms of nature laws. When you're losing forest area, it has these implications. And then you also highlight, put very strongly to the fore the fact that we have these multiple asymmetries in our global economic system, which again, I think is something we have a particular interest in at SOAS. And finally, both in yours and in Tom's inaugural lecture, I thought there was this very strong thread, which was about justice. And again, I think that resonates very nicely with what I think is one of the mandates of our institution here at SOAS, which is this very strong concern and commitment to social justice. So thanks a lot. With that, let me close the formal proceedings and invite all of you for a drink in the foyer in front of our lecture theatre. Thank you.